There's something happening in American politics and the media that you need to be very mindful of. And I actually want to talk to those of you who are on the left for just a moment and tell you how you are being manipulated. And it's often so easy to see people on the other side of the aisle being manipulated. You very often aren't aware of how you yourself are being manipulated, because very often it's an issue that is emotional and passionate, and the manipulators come in and manipulate you to drive you towards their agenda. It happens on the right, it happens on the left, and right now the left is being manipulated in a concerted effort by members of the media and the Democratic machine. It has everything to do with one issue. You've lost the United States Supreme Court. You lost. This goes back to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where if you remember right, and it's a true story, I'm not your Google, you can Google it yourself, but it's true. In the Republican primary, Hillary Clinton's campaign spent money elevating Donald Trump. They were convinced that if Donald Trump were the Republican nominee, she would be a shoo-in. Surprise! Donald Trump won. While all of this was happening, there was a lady you might have heard of. Her name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had been pressured heavily when Barack Obama was president to retire. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in poor health. She had had repeated bouts of cancer and other issues. Her husband was dying and then died, and they pressured her very hard to retire. And no, she wanted to retire with Hillary Clinton as president of the United States, so the first female president could replace this icon of the feminist movement. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had an ego, and the left fed her ego. The notorious RBG, they called her. Well, the notorious RBG got it in her head that she could outlive them all despite all of her health, and she didn't. Donald Trump became president, and the notorious RBG died. Donald Trump, in a single term, got to put 3 people on the United States Supreme Court and decisively shifted it right. Now, it had always been right-leaning, but Sandra Day O'Connor and then Anthony Kennedy, they were swingy votes on social issues in particular. O'Connor and Kennedy always leaned a little bit to the left. Kennedy had this very self-centered jurisprudence. It was what makes Anthony Kennedy happy and powerful. And if you could understand how Anthony Kennedy would be happy and powerful, you understood how he would rule on something. And typically he was a Chamber of Commerce guy. He hated Obamacare. He was furious with John Roberts' decision to preserve Obamacare. John Roberts, of course, did all of his master manipulations and plotting because he really thought the Supreme Court needed to be pulled out of politics. And he did it, the Obamacare decision, to pull the Supreme Court out of politics, which came across as cravenly political. These guys have 10 ears when it comes to politics. But the Supreme Court decisively went to the right. You now have a 6-3 majority, and really it depends on what day of the week it is, whether Mercury is in retrograde, and how John Roberts feels about the tidal pools of Washington as to whether or not he sides with the Democrats or not. I actually give Roberts a hard time, but I do understand his point of view. He's an incrementalist. He doesn't believe in rushing things ahead. And in fact, historically, when it comes to the preservation of the integrity of the court, maybe he was right. Maybe history will judge him that way. Because what's happened is with a 6-3 Supreme Court majority that leans right and the end of Roe v. Wade, the Democrats have resumed their high-tech lynching of Clarence Thomas. When Clarence Thomas was put on the Supreme Court, I remember it. I was a kid. I remember. So back in the day, you had cable, but you didn't have a lot of cable. And most people still watched ABC, CBS, NBC. Fox really wasn't that much of a thing in parts of the country. And it was wall-to-wall media coverage on TV of Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, the allegations, Joe Biden, chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And Thomas was confirmed, barely confirmed, but he was confirmed to the United States Supreme Court. Thomas tells the story that he was actually sitting in the bathtub. Ginny, his wife, knocked on the door and told him the Senate confirmed him, and he said, whoop-de-doo, and slid under the water. The Democrats have always hated Clarence Thomas. Now, to understand the hate for Clarence Thomas, you need to understand a guy named Miguel Estrada. Miguel Estrada was a Court of Appeals nominee for the D.C. Circuit for George Bush. This guy was clearly being fast-tracked as a Hispanic conservative to the Supreme Court. And Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, who was on the Judiciary Committee, very outspokenly and frankly said they could not allow Miguel Estrada to be appointed to the Court of Appeals because they could not allow George W. Bush to get the first Hispanic pick on the Supreme Court. They literally, openly said that. It was an identity politics battle that Miguel Estrada, a noted, highly respected jurist, got caught in the middle of. The Democrats playing games with the racial composition of the Supreme Court for partisan political purposes. The Democrats have always treated the court as a political appendage. It's why, if you understand that, you understand why John Roberts sometimes votes the way he does. He's pro-life. He's a conservative. His wife led a pro-life group, but you understand his hesitancy sometimes when you understand that he's very mindful of how politicized the court can sometimes appear and how the left in particular has repeatedly politicized the court. It's something when Roberts worked in the Reagan administration, I think the first Bush administration, Roberts at one point pinned something about how the Democrats believe the Supreme Court in some way is an appendage of theirs, is a partisan tool. Well, they lost the partisan tool. So they've been manufacturing stories about Clarence Thomas ever since, and Sam Alito. If you listen to the media now and you listen to the Senate Democrats now, Clarence Thomas is somehow doing something illegal, unethical, improper. He's got friends who have been generous with him, who had no business before the court. That's key here. You need to understand. They had no business before the court. Now, the leftists tried to manufacture it and claim, well, there was a business that he owned stock in. He had no say in the company, just he was an investor in the company, but it was his company because he was an investor, therefore their conflict. People on the left have just embraced this idea that, if you've got a friend who's generous with you, as Clarence Thomas friends have been, well, that means you're corrupted by them. It's not true. I'm very generous with my friends. Now, I'm not a billionaire, so I can't be as generous as Harlan Crow can be to his friends, but I'm generous with my friends. I don't expect anything in return. They're just my friends. Take them to Las Vegas, among other things. But the left now says that that's a conflict of interest. Now, there's no rule about that. What's so interesting here, though, is that the progressive members of the Supreme Court have done the same thing. You never heard the left get outraged about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and all the lavish trips that she got and didn't disclose, by the way. You never heard the left concerned about Stephen Breyer's ties to the Pritzker family, a very powerful, very wealthy Democratic family. You never heard concerns about that. You've never heard concerns about Elena Kagan or Sonia Sotomayor and what the left does for them. You're only exclusively hearing about it from the right. This is where this comes into the manipulation of progressives. You're being told that things that aren't conflicts of interest are, or that they have the appearance of being. Because you don't have a generous friend who's generous with you, you can be led to believe that that generosity is a sign of some sort of taint, of some sort of corruption, even though it's not. You're being manipulated. Because the left now, because they've lost the court and Roe v. Wade, must discredit the institution. There's no difference between what the left is doing to the Supreme Court now than what they do with the Senate every time Republicans get in charge of it. They say, it's anti-democratic, it's unrepresentative, it's filled with these white Republicans who disproportionately represent the minority of the country. We should have nothing to do with it. If the left can't wield the power of the institution, they must discredit the institution because it's all about the power. That's what they're doing here. They've re-engaged the digital high-tech lynching of Clarence Thomas. Not because they think they can oust a man who has life tenure and there are not enough votes to impeach him, but because they think they can drum up enough opposition to the court so that Americans hear the decisions of the court the left doesn't like and decides that they are heretical decisions, they are discredited decisions, they are anathema against the will of the people. And what's actually happening, what the Supreme Court has been doing is releasing decision after decision after decision that aligns with the Constitution. There's something notable about the left's position on judicial orthodoxy and on constitutional interpretation. What the left wishes you to do is rely on old masters in black robes to tell you what the law is. And what the constitutional jurisprudence of the right is that you, regular American citizens, should be able to read the Constitution for yourself and understand generally what it means and have the laws and jurisprudence of the country reflect that basic understanding. Now, some friends of mine in the conservative legal movement aren't going to like this comparison, but I actually think it's apt. One of the Reformation criticisms of Martin Luther towards the Catholic Church at the time was that everything was done in Latin and all the Bibles were in Latin, and having English Bibles and Bibles in native tongues was not something regularly done, and that the Bible should be accessible in native tongue. It's actually something in the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church embraced, that, you know what, we should be speaking in the language the people understand in the local community. What the conservative jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, overwhelmingly led by Catholics, by the way, has done is that we should, all of us, be able to read the Constitution and have a general understanding of it and how it works, and the jurisprudence of the country should reflect that. And what the left wants is that we should have these authoritarian elite gods before us, this meritocracy, bureaucracy, this elite Plato sort of group there to tell us what the law means. And that we should not be able to understand it for ourselves. We should have to rely on this elite group of black-robed masters who we swear allegiance before and offer sacrifice to, and they tell us what the law is. The left wishes you to be disconnected from the law, because if you are disconnected from the law, then suddenly you have to rely on them to tell you what the law is. And the right believes you should be able to read the law yourself and understand it without having to go to law school, because a democracy, a republic of the people, for the people, by the people, depends on the people being able to access their charter documents and understand it. And because Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and John Roberts have decided that you, the people of the United States, should be able to read the Constitution for yourself and divine its meaning without relying on black-robed masters of life tenure, well, that's bad. Because if you can understand the laws and the Constitution of the country, the left can't exert undue power on you. And so because they've lost that fight, they now choose to discredit the court they don't control and lie to you and conjure fictions and fears that don't exist, while ignoring, so that you aren't revealed the truth, that they themselves have done the same thing. Because the truth doesn't matter, the narrative does. And they lose power when you can read the Constitution for yourself and understand it. And that's why Clarence Thomas is the bad guy, because he's made the Constitution directly understandable by you.
Want to be on the show?